Welcome back. As we talk in this first episode about how can we put a correct biblical worldview into mathematics, I want to look at step one. What about number sets, number theory? Now that sounds really high level, and you can take it really high level all the way to high school geometry and beyond. But this is something that we begin teaching our children in elementary school. What is the difference between whole numbers and natural numbers? What are all of these different symbols we use to represent them? What are integers? So as each of these new sets of numbers comes up, these new definitions and lists of what is included and what is not included, we want to consider that each time we teach our child a new set, when we go from natural numbers to whole numbers, from whole numbers to integers, from integers to rational numbers, and from rational to irrational, each of those 5 opportunities we have, we want to point our children back to the answers to the 3 big questions that make this a biblical worldview in mathematics. So, as we look at number sets, we first teach our children about natural numbers versus whole versus integers and all of these things. What we're ultimately looking at is that there is a list of items, we call them numbers in this case, that God has put together and grouped into a category. Now in this case they form a pattern, but they go into a category. There is another list of items that is in a separate category, and another list of items that's in a separate category. Some of these categories have overlap. Integers, for instance, would include the natural numbers, -10, -9, all the way up to +9, +10, and beyond. The natural numbers would be those that you start out when you're very young learning. You count from 1 all the way to as high as you can get. Well, these two overlap, but sometimes there isn't overlap. And so we look at these things, and what we understand is we have to zoom out a little bit, generalize so that we can understand what's happening. What we see is that God has created things and they fit into categories. Some of the categories have some overlap and some of them are very distinct. What is this? What is this teaching us about who God is and his nature? Well, what we see from Scripture and is supported by creation, is supported by these other items, is that God is the one who creates categories. He creates distinction and he places separation. When you see it that way and you look through Scripture, you'll find so many cases where you can have good conversations with your child each time you introduce a new kind of numbers to them, to remind them, remember, God's the one who creates these categories. God's the one who puts separation and distinction between them, and it is good that we have a category to call this by, and good that we can distinguish between these categories. And it begins all the way back in Genesis 1. So if you're looking for some scripture references to go to, in Genesis 1, the whole chapter is filled with God creating things, categorizing them, and putting separation between them. Light, darkness. How many kinds of light are there? Yet light and darkness are 2 different categories. Many things within the light category, but it's different, distinct from the darkness category. Male and female, 2 distinct categories that God has created. Again, read through the whole chapter. There's animals that live in the water, animals that fly in the air, animals that live on the ground. These are categories God has created. Lots of kinds of animals within each of those categories, some which may share features with creatures from other categories, but it is God who has defined and created the distinctions. And so when we in math are learning about these different kinds or sets of numbers, and we learn what goes in each category, what are similarities between categories, but what is the boundary, what is the distinction, what we are practicing is recognizing God's boundaries and God's categories and submitting to them. This is morality training right here in math class. And it is a very vital morality training because question number 2, what this reveals to us about human nature is we don't like that God gets to define those categories. We don't like that God separates those categories. Don't believe me? Look at our world. God created male and female. God defined the categories and God separated the categories, and what does our society want to do with that? And then look, have they not done it in every other area? They're trying to do it in modern universities with mathematics as well. Some of the ways they try to do it is by eliminating teaching it. Oh, we shouldn't have to teach number sets and number theory. That's very abstract and arbitrary and not practical. It's not utilitarian. Delete that. They're trying to erase something much more important than what they're telling you. They want to erase God as the authority for creating boundaries. They want to blur any distinctions between things that ought to be separated. And one way you can make this very concrete in a young child's mind is by teaching them number sets in math and stressing to them that it is important that they understand the boundaries God has created. So then as we come to the last question, we should always answer, why should we learn this thing? What is its purpose for me in this life God has placed me in? And the answer to that, you're going to have to tailor a little bit. So I'll send you to do some homework. With the advent of AI, like it or not, you can very simply do a quick search in Google or your favorite one and say, where are number sets used in real life? Enter. And it will actually return you quite a few, both results and links, which you'll need to click on to ensure that they are real, that will give you ideas as to what fits in your family, what fits in your situation, what fits for the child that you're addressing. Sometimes you might find something that sparks an interest. Maybe they have an interest in baking or cooking, and Google was able to point you to something you didn't know, but that fit with baking and cooking, and you clicked now with that child. Maybe it's something that's specific to, rocketry, race cars. You fill in the blanks. Because I don't want you dependent on me to think of the things for you, I point you to that. Use the internet as a resource so that you can find those specific, what can I do with this in real life? And I will tell you, one of the things that I do is I either point them to something that they depend on daily but don't personally use, or point them to something that they as an adult will need to personally use. So just for example, because we're talking about number sets and theories, they may not personally need to use the distinctions between rational and irrational numbers or integers. However, they do need to know the patterns for working with integers, for working with natural numbers, in order to do anything with money. Integers really is just balancing your bank account. What's coming in, what's going out. The amount that's coming in is your positive numbers. The amount that's going out is your negative numbers. And you need to be able to work fluidly between those so that you have an accurate understanding of where are you at the end of each month as your paychecks come in. Now, your child is a child, but you need to be training them to be an adult. So you shouldn't be speaking to them as though they're just going to be a child forever. Don't say things to them like, you'll need this later, but don't worry about it now. Don't do that. Tell them, look, here's what I as an adult have to do as the mom of the household to make sure that our finances are okay, to know what my grocery budget is for the week. You're going to have to do this one day, so I want you to start learning it now. That just conversation shift is very useful and gives you just one example of how I can put this together with number sets. So again, use the internet, use the resources available to you to help you fill in very specific answers to those why questions. And that's all that we have today for number sets.